Hello there, my name's Gavin and I'm one of the consultant psychologists here in Salisbury and the head of the clinical psychology department here at the hospital. Welcome to this webinar on worry management and problem solving. It's one of a series of webinars that we've created as a team that we hope will be helpful in providing some information and some tips and advice on managing some of the common psychological issues that can arise when you or a loved one is experiencing a physical health concern. So within this webinar, we'll look at defining worry to understand what worry is and what it isn't. We'll look at the signs and symptoms of worry to help in spotting if worry is becoming a problem for you or for a loved one. We'll then turn to how common worry is, particularly in the context of physical health concerns, and why it happens and what keeps it stuck or keeps it happening. Then we'll look at strategies to manage and overcome worry using a common approach called the worry tree. And finally, we'll look at problem solving, which is a component of the worry tree for genuine current problems that we have some control over. So first off, we need to understand what worry is. If we look at the dictionary definition, it describes a feeling of anxiety or feeling troubled about both actual and potential problems. And it's really important to keep in mind throughout this webinar that worry can be about actual or potential or hypothetical problems, and we'll come back to that in future slides. So in terms of worry, there's three key components. First of all, a problem or an unpleasant thing that might happen. Secondly, that makes us feel unhappy or frightened. And thirdly, that we then think often repeatedly about that problem or that unpleasant thing in a way that continues to make us feel unhappy or frightened. So very much as a cycle. And for people who are experiencing worry, this repeats itself as a pattern. And sometimes that's around a single thing, for example, an operation. Sometimes that might be around related things. So, for example, the entirety of a health condition and all of the consequences or likely outcomes of that. Or sometimes it might be across a range of different things in our life, which includes health, but also non-health related areas. And some of the people that we see in the team here might have had an experience of worrying excessively even before their physical health diagnosis, but it might be magnified or supercharged by the physical health issues that they're experiencing. So what are some of the signs and symptoms of worry? Well, one of the key features is that our brains can feel really busy, and that can feel really exhausting. So in terms of what goes on in our brains, often when we're worrying and suffering from worry, we'll think excessively about problems or unpleasant things that could happen. Sometimes people find they're running through all of the likely scenarios and the potential impact on us or on other people around us who we care about. And again, sometimes when people are experiencing worry, they might also have thoughts about their own ability to cope, but also the ability of others around them who they really care about to cope with whatever those potential problems or unpleasant things might be. So you might relate to some of those as you hear them. And this isn't exhaustive, but see, these are some of the common signs and symptoms. We also experience some emotions, and this might include feeling anxious or worried. Sometimes this escalates to the point that people will feel panicked. Often there's a degree of uncertainty, a feeling of uncertainty and feeling unsettled. Sometimes people also feel unhappy, or they might feel demoralized or helpless. So there really can be a combination of different emotions in the mix. Many people who experience worry describe quite strong physical symptoms as well, and often this revolves around having a tight chest, a racing heart, feeling their breathings become more rapid. Sometimes people describe muscle tension and headaches. As I mentioned before, often people might describe feeling exhausted, and sometimes that's a exhaustion in terms of their brain being tired, but sometimes that might also cause a physical exhaustion. And often people that are experiencing worry and suffering problems with worry might find that their sleep is affected too because of the extent to which they're worrying. And again, that can make the exhaustion even more exaggerated and harder to deal with. And finally, when people are experiencing worry, that often affects the things they do and their behaviours. And some of the common behaviours that you might see are fretting or repeatedly thinking over potential problems, trying to problem solve every eventuality or all of those scenarios. Or at the other extreme, you might find that you're trying to avoid or suppress thinking about those potential problems or unpleasant things. So as we've gone through, there may well be things in the mix there that you recognise in yourself or in your loved ones that might demonstrate that worry is an issue or becoming a problem. As we mentioned on the previous slide, sometimes when people are suffering from worry, it can affect their mood and it can affect some of the thoughts they're having. And occasionally people might start to experience suicidal thoughts or thoughts of self-harm. So if you're experiencing that or a loved one is experiencing that, please do reach out for support from mental health crisis services. So you can call NHS 111 and select option 2. That will connect you to your local mental health crisis services. Some people find it hard to speak to someone directly on the phone, so you can also use a text service and text shout to 85258. Or there's Samaritans or Childline, and there's some local numbers there at the bottom as well. So how common is worry? Well, there are many, many studies that look at how common anxiety is for adults, and these vary greatly depending on the country or the population group that people have looked at in the research. But the World Health Organization estimates that around 4.4% of adults globally experience anxiety. Now, it's worth mentioning this isn't specifically worry, but it's a more global difficulty of anxiety, of which worry may be a part. There are very few studies that look specifically at worry on its own. If we look at populations of people with physical health concerns, and this is based on largely on UK studies, so for people with a diagnosis of diabetes, 16 to 20% of them experience anxiety difficulties, of which worry is a part. For people who have been an inpatient in intensive care, 25 to 46% report anxiety symptoms, significant anxiety symptoms after their admission. For people with burns injuries, around 16% experience anxiety. And finally, people with cancer, so 23% of people with a cancer diagnosis experience difficulties with anxiety. And when you delve into that further, those levels of anxiety are higher in people who have a diagnosis of lung cancer or breast or ovarian cancer. And for breast cancer survivors, the rates of anxiety difficulties or disorders is around 42%. So this isn't an exhaustive list of physical health difficulties, but gives an illustration of how common and how much more common anxiety difficulties are for people who are also experiencing or have lived through physical health concerns. So if you or a loved one is experiencing worry and problematic worry, then that's quite a common response to a physical health concern. And the rest of this webinar is going to move on to looking at then how you might address that and start to tackle and overcome that. So why does anxiety happen? Some really key things to remember here. So firstly, as human beings, we're programmed to solve problems. So our brains are primed to come up with solutions if there are any problems, current or potential future problems that we face. We're also programmed to find it really difficult to tolerate uncertainty. Now, some people manage uncertainty just fine, but many people, to a greater or lesser degree, really struggle when things are uncertain. Because again, we are primed to want predictability, because predictability means that we can safeguard ourselves and protect ourselves, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Worry is a perfectly natural response to an anticipated future problem. So in essence, I think what those first 3 bullet points are saying is it is quite a normal thing, and we are pre-programmed to worry. But we recognise that sometimes that can tip over and become excessive or problematic and impact quite significantly on our lives. The act of worrying, so coming back to our previous slide on signs and symptoms, so worrying is when we think something over excessively and we might start to try to troubleshoot all the possible scenarios. So the act of worrying can make us feel like we're doing something about the thing we're worried about and that we're taking control and preparing for the future. And that can be really comforting to us at times of uncertainty. So it becomes especially true that we're more vulnerable to worrying and we're more likely to worry excessively when the future's uncertain, unpredictable or scary, and when things feel out of our control. And often when we have health concerns, all of those things may be true. So that perhaps helps us understand some of those figures on the previous slide. The action of worrying, so this excessive thinking over of potential problems or actual problems and troubleshooting those, running through scenarios, so that action of worrying actually distracts us from the emotions, from the distressing emotions that those anticipated future problems make us feel. So in a way, although we might not realize it, worry, or the act of worrying, is a type of avoidance because it helps us avoid feeling the difficult emotions. And it helps us feel like we're taking control. So if we put all of that together, here's one of the psychological models of worry. So the starting point is a trigger. That might be an external or an internal trigger. So a trigger in terms of events or our environment or something going on inside us. And that leads to us thinking about a potential future problem or unpleasant thing. That then triggers emotions, so we then start to feel anxious, we start to feel worried, we might start to feel panicked, and we feel uncertain. Those are not nice feelings to have, so that then drives us to do something. And often, in a worrying cycle, what we do is we think the problem over and over, as we said on the previous slide, and we run scenarios and potential solutions and fixes, and for some people we might seek reassurance from others as well at those points in time. And you know what? That can work. It can distract us from our emotions. It can feel like we're doing something proactive about it or solving the problem. And it might, even if it's very, very short-lived, it might then reduce the emotion or distract us from the emotion for a period of time. So it makes sense why we do the things that we do when we feel that way. However, it provides us with some short-term respite sometimes, but it doesn't stop us thinking about potential future problems or unpleasant things, feeling anxious, worried or panicked or uncertain the next time a trigger arises. So we end up stuck in a loop. And what we know for physical health conditions or injuries, as we've said on the previous slides, is that that can be a real trigger point, and that can really turbocharge this cycle. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of worry and the worry cycle and how it might get stuck. So how do you break the cycle? Well, the key to breaking the cycle is understanding what we can do something different about. And in the cycle, there are some things that are outside of our control, but there are some things that are in our control. And the key part that is in our control is our response. So we can look at what we might do instead of thinking the problem over and over, running scenarios and potential solutions, or seeking reassurance from others. And by doing something different at that point in the cycle, the hope is that it then reduces the link to those outcomes and those short-term fixes. So the cycle begins to break down. So how do you do that? Or how does a loved one begin to do that? Well, one of the common approaches to this is called the worry tree. And there are some different stages within the worry tree. So I'll present them on this slide, and then there's a visual on the next slide. So the first step is to spot yourself worrying. Really important. Spot yourself worrying. And when you spot yourself worrying, press the pause button, step back and try to identify what it is that you're worrying about. Once you've identified what it is that you're worrying about, try to categorize that worry. Is this a real and current problem? Or is it a hypothetical future problem or unpleasant thing? So often that might take the form of a what if this? So what if this happens or what if that happens? That can be a helpful way of spotting some of those hypothetical worries. Sometimes there might be elements of both. So as an example, a few years ago I had to have an operation to remove a kidney stone, and before I went in for the operation I had a worry in terms of, well, what if the operation doesn't go well? My wife doesn't know where our life insurance certificates are. So within that worry there is a genuine current problem, which is my wife doesn't know where our life insurance certificates are. But there is also a hypothetical element, which is what if the operation goes wrong? So it can be really important to tease out those different parts of the thing that you're worrying about. If it is a real and current problem, is it something you can do anything about? So for example, my wife doesn't know where my our life insurance documents are. Is that something I can do anything about? Yes, it is. I can tell her where they are, or I can show her where they are. Our third step is going to depend on whether it's a real and current problem that's in our control, or whether it's a hypothetical future problem or unpleasant thing, or a current problem that we are unable to do anything about. So if it's a hypothetical worry, a what if, or if it's a worry about an uncontrollable situation, then what we will do at that point in time is try to let that worry go. Now that's a lot easier said than done, and there are some tips on that in the coming slides. But the first step within that is reminding yourself that worrying is a circular process, and it's likely to be repetitive, and it's not likely to resolve those worries about hypothetical things or problems that are outside of your control. You can think and think and think and think over it, but it won't solve the issue. So that's our first step. Then we would try to refocus our attention on something else. And again, that can sound a lot easier said than done, and we'll come on to some tips for that in the next couple of slides. Alternatively, if there's a current problem that is under your control, problem solve that situation and implement your chosen solution. Or if you can't do it immediately, plan when you will do it, and then try to refocus your attention on something else in the meantime. So again, going back to the example of the life insurance, if my wife was in, I could call her and show her the documents or get them out or tell her where they are. If she's maybe out, then I can plan that I'll do that when she comes back, and then I try to refocus my attention rather than continuing to worry about that problem all the time until she returns. So here's what this looks like in visual form. Some of the wording is slightly different, but the process and the concepts are still the same. So the first step in the worry tree is to notice the worry and to figure what you're worrying about. Second step is, can you do anything about it? So that's where we're categorizing the worry. Is it hypothetical, or is it a real problem that I can't do anything about, or is this a real problem that I can do anything about? And then that will determine what we do next. So if it's not something I can do something about, then I try to let the worry go and distract myself or refocus my attention. If it is something I can do something about, then I would create a plan and either do it now or do it later. So some people find it helpful to have the steps laid out as they are in the previous slide. Some people prefer a visual like this slide. So as I said, often this can feel a lot easier said than done. So here's some tips to let worries go. So first of all, it can be really helpful to keep a worry diary. There's something about the act of writing things down and getting them out of your head that can help from the get-go in terms of tackling that cycle. So keep a worry diary. Have somewhere that you write those worries down when they come to you. And it's up to you whether at that point in time you categorize them or whether you just write them down and then you come back to look at categorizing them and using the worry tree later on. For some people who find that they worry excessively throughout the day, it can be helpful to schedule worry time each day. And there's some really key tips to this. So first of all, it shouldn't be too long, because the longer it is, the higher the risk is that you're going to get into that cycle of thinking and thinking and thinking. So I think usually about 15 to 20 minutes maximum. A key tip is to not do that immediately before bed, because you might find that while you're doing the worry time, your anxiety does rise a bit. And what we don't want is for that then to affect your sleep. When you sit down to do the worry time, it's helpful to then go through worries that maybe you've logged throughout the day and identify which of those worries are still with you. And if there are worries that maybe you had at the time but are no longer such an issue or a concern, then you can discard those. And then use the worry tree process that we've covered on the previous couple of slides to work through those remaining worries. Once you've done that, you can discard any resolved worries, and there may be worries that you haven't managed to resolve, in which case you would park them until your next worry time. So you're not ignoring them, but you're just recognizing that you've got some time scheduled in where you'll look at those and think about those. And the final tip for letting worries go, particularly if you're noticing some of those physical sensations and some really strong emotions in terms of anxiety, panic, is to use some relaxation strategies. So sometimes there are breathing strategies or progressive muscle relaxation or imagery or mindfulness. And on our YouTube channel, we've got some videos and some audios that can guide you through some of those practices. So how about refocusing attention? Again, that can sound a lot easier than it is in practice. So here's some tips that can help refocus your attention from what it is that you're worried about. And the whole idea with this is that we're bringing your attention back out into the world from being internal in your mind, in your head. So first of all, what were you doing before you noticed yourself worrying? And can you return to that activity or task? So often when we're worrying, it pops in when we're in the middle of doing something. So can you go back to that? If that's not possible, or if you find that that doesn't help to refocus your attention, find something else to do. See if you can find an activity or task to do that you know grabs your attention and focus. And the final tip for refocusing attention is a strategy called grounding. And there are different ways of doing grounding, and the way that we're going to cover here on the slide is essentially around taking notice. So there is a lot going on around us all the time that we don't necessarily notice, that we don't really pay attention to. So grounding is a practice, or this particular type of grounding is a way of us starting to take notice of those things, and using our senses can be a really powerful way of doing that. So first of all, what can you see around you? Have a look around. Does anything catch your eye in a pleasant way? And why? Why does it catch your eye? What is it about it that you find pleasant? Spend some time then focusing on that thing. How does that make you feel inside? Some people describe quite a physical reaction to things that are visually pleasing. What are the different sounds or things that you can hear? Is there anything that you can hear that sounds interesting? Can you notice any smells? What can you feel? You might be sitting down right now, or you might be lying down. Are you aware of what you're sitting on and the texture, the softness, the temperature? So touch some of the things around you and notice their texture and temperature. Find something that feels nice to touch and focus on that thing. Or are there any things that you like the taste of? Are they available? Could you go and grab them out of the cupboard and not just eat them, but just notice what they feel like in your mouth and what that taste feels like in your mouth? And some of these things might sound a little silly, but we know that our senses can be really powerful in capturing our attention. And ultimately what we're trying to do here, as I say, is bring our focus out of our head, but also disrupt that worry cycle. And anything that we can do to disrupt that worry cycle is likely to be helpful, even if it's short-lived. So the final step in terms of worry management is problem solving. So this is on the side of the worry tree where there are genuine current problems that are within our gift or within our control to do something about. And there are some Again, step-by-step approaches to problem solving that can be helpful. Sometimes there might be a solution that's obvious immediately. So my life insurance certificate example is that there is a clear solution. I don't need to go through a formal problem solving approach. But for other problems that are maybe more complex or where there's more of a dilemma around them, this particular approach can be quite helpful. So first of all, define the problem. What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Or what's the issue that you're trying to solve, or the dilemma that you're trying to solve? Second step, identify your goal. What do you want to get out of any solution? So an example from some people that we work with here in the department, they might have withdrawn from seeing friends because they're worried that their friends are going to ask them how they are, and they don't want to talk about their health condition. Their goal might be that they want to see their friends again, but they don't want to talk about their physical health concerns. So it can be helpful to identify that goal because it frames the next steps. So the third step then is to list all the possible solutions. And one thing that's really important at this stage is to reserve judgment. It can be very easy as you're listing the solutions to discount them very quickly. So at this stage, just write them all down, come up with all the possible solutions. Then we're going to evaluate them. So then we're going to look at the pros and cons of each. And as you're doing that, it can be helpful to think about how easy they would be to do and how likely they would be to achieve the goal that you set out at stage 2, at step 2. And then finally, choose a solution, plan it and try it. So plan the what, the when and the how. It might be that solution works brilliantly, but if not, that's not the end of the world. We just return back to the evaluation of the potential solutions. So that particular solution didn't work. Are there tweaks we can make to it? Or there are other potential solutions that we identified that we could try out then instead. So to sum up, first of all, worry is a natural response to an anticipated problem, whether that's real or hypothetical, especially at times when we feel things are more uncertain or out of our control. Secondly, the act of worrying can keep the worry going and make us even more anxious in the long run and leave us feeling quite exhausted and demoralised. Spotting yourself worrying and identifying what you're worrying about can be really helpful, because that then allows us to problem solve real problems or issues or dilemmas that we have some control over. And it also helps us then to think about how we might let the worries go and refocus our attention if the worries are about hypothetical problems or problems that we don't have any control over. And sometimes writing worries down or scheduling worry time and using relaxation or grounding can be helpful to break the worry cycle, alongside the worry tree and problem solving. So what next? Well, first off, I really hope this webinar has been helpful, and I hope there's some tips and strategies that you might take from the webinar and start to use in your everyday life. Remember, progress is never a straight line, so often there are hiccups or bumps along the way. So there might be times the approach works, and there might be other times where it's more difficult to do. It might depend on the worry, it might depend on the time of day, how you're feeling physically or emotionally. And remember, often the strategies that we've covered are aiming to try to tackle a cycle which has almost become habitual. So it might not be 100% effective right from the start. So try to keep going and keep trying, and don't beat yourself up if it doesn't work every single time. Secondly, sometimes people need the help of a psychologist or a counsellor or a therapist to work through this approach, and that, again, that's absolutely fine. So details of our service can be found by searching online for Salisbury Hospital Clinical Psychology. For some of you that are watching the webinar, you may already have been referred to our team, or if not, you can ask your clinical team to refer you to us. This is very much an approach to tackle excessive worrying, but some people also feel anxious or panicked or depressed, and that might need other approaches or strategies to help. So we do have some other webinars on some of those areas, so it's worth having a look at those, or otherwise our team are trained in approaches that can help with all of those other things as well. And finally, some people may benefit from medication instead of or alongside psychological approaches to help manage their worry and anxiety. If you feel that might be the case for you, or if that would be your preference, then we'd encourage you to speak to your GP or your clinical team, and they'll be able to talk through what options there might be and what some of the contraindications might be with other medications that you're on. So as I say, we hope this webinar has been helpful. I hope there's some useful tips and advice and strategies that you might start to use. And thank you for watching.